This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor at Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Blessed Stanley Rother Shrine. Just recently, the Pope made the news by acknowledging what Pope John Paul II mentioned over and over again during his time as Pope. Francis reminded his audience that we are now living in the age of martyrs. This is the time when people are being killed for professing their faith. This is the age of the witnesses to the life of faith and the truth of the gospel of Christ in the church. Not just the first centuries and not just in the Roman Empire hostile to the faith, but today, in our time. This is the age when the greatest number of those killed for the faith is from. Anybody who's been paying attention knows this is true. Just recently, the group Inter-Society published a report indicating that 52,000 Christians in Nigeria have been killed in the last 14 years. 14 years. That means, just in case we need to be reminded, since 2009, there have been the same number of people killed as witnesses to their faith as Christians as there are U.S. soldiers stationed in Japan. And 2009 wasn't that long ago. It's when Windows 7 was released, when Michael Jackson died, and when Barack Obama was inaugurated. And in that time, in that one country in Africa, tens of thousands were paying the price of belief with their blood. This doesn't count the other tens of thousands who were killed and many others who suffered the loss of their property, their freedom, their health, or their citizenship in other places because they held on to their belief in Christ. We'd also need to add to the number of martyrs that this doesn't include those who suffered persecution for what they believed. That number is almost impossible to quantify, but it certainly includes those who were demoted or discouraged or intimidated because of their affirmation of the faith. They didn't pay with blood because the price was not that high, but they did pay. It hasn't been easy to be a Christian, and we're seeing that truth unfold before our eyes. This is not hidden from us, at least it shouldn't be. What is odd is the varied responses to the truth of this suffering. I call to mind two different ones. The first comes from a novel by Michael O'Brien called Father Elijah. I didn't find the book all that great, but there is a scene that I remember well. In the novel, a group of African sisters are standing in St. Peter's Square during the Sunday blessing by the Pope. The main character, an American, is standing next to these African sisters, while there are two American sisters standing next to him. At the Sunday blessing, the Pope asks everyone to pray for the African church and the suffering that it was experiencing. After the prayers, one of the American sisters turned to the other and says, "The African church may have lots of people going to Mass and a lot of people in religious orders, but it's not really that serious. They say that the church in Africa is a mile wide and an inch deep." Unaware that they've been overheard, the American sisters walk away. The African sisters turn to this American next to them and ask where he's from. And when he says he's from the U.S., the senior sister presses her rosary into his hand. She says to him, "Here's the rosary that belonged to our founder. It still has her blood on it from when she was murdered for the faith. Take this and pray on it for the faith to be spread everywhere." It was a startling scene. There's a kind of dismissal of the sufferings of the church all over the world as if that suffering doesn't count. Or worse, we understand that there are some parts of the world that is the place where people suffer as a matter of course. So we hardly notice when people pay the price for what they believe and say. Africa is one of those places where life is hard and the price of faithfulness is inflated because the price for everything, including peace, prosperity, and opportunity, is also high. We have a temptation to imagine that somehow such suffering is of no account because it is of those who are different than we. This other account, the other example, comes from a group of priests who were reporting on an incident of their own bishop who was visiting in Rome. This isn't from a novel. This is a true story. As you know, every 5 years, each bishop goes to Rome to report on his administration of his diocese. There was this group of bishops from one of the regions in the United States that had gone to Rome to give their report, as well as to address some of the concerns of their dioceses. And one of those concerns was the question of girl altar servers. There were lots of people in Rome who were against having girl altar servers, while it was already a common practice in the United States. And the bishops, they wanted to get some clarification for their priests. So when this particular bishop got back to the U.S., he was asked by his priest whether he was able to get some decision from the Pope about the issue. And the bishop said, "Well, we were in line to go into the room and speak to the Pope, but we were held up for more than an hour. And when the group ahead of us came out, we found out it was a group of bishops from Africa. So we asked them, why had the meeting taken so long? And then one of the bishops from the group told the Americans that just as they were ready to go in to see the Pope, one of the bishops in the group had gotten a message that 15 of the catechists from his diocese had been beheaded that morning. So they spent some time with the Pope, talking about the challenges that they faced in that diocese and praying for all of those who had been killed and for all their families, as well as for all of those who were working to be educated in that diocese. And then that American bishop said to his priest, "I couldn't face the prospect of going into the Pope in the face of all those teachers who had been beheaded for the faith, and to tell him that the big concern in our diocese was whether girls could serve Mass or not. I just couldn't do it." And then the priest, talking to me, reporting this to me, said, "I told him, my bishop, that he shouldn't have been dismayed by the Africans. He should have talked to the Pope about girl servers because they were the concern for his diocese." I know that sounds kind of fantastic, but that's what they said. My sympathies are with the bishops. How could anyone speak of who could put on a cassock and carry the processional cross after the price paid by those in that African country who had paid the ultimate price of belief with their lives? But such is the reality of the price that's paid. It's not always acknowledged or understood. And this is the first difficulty we have as we live in the age of martyrs. It's the overwhelming truth that we almost never understand the gravity of what we experience until it's too late. It may have been the same during the time of the Roman martyrs. Probably it was. We're too preoccupied with what's going on in our own lives to notice what's happening in the lives of others. Their sufferings pass like storm clouds pass on an Oklahoma afternoon. We notice them building and darkening, and we certainly comment on the destruction and the noise that they can cause, but they pass, and then things quickly get back to normal. After a while, they simply become part of the scenery of our lives, and we dismiss them and all that they can bring until the next time. The word martyr comes from the Greek word for witness. Even at the beginning of the Christian world, this word was connected to those who bore witness to the truth of the faith by their death. Those who were killed for the faith we know as martyrs, witnesses, as members of the category of those who were not afraid to witness to the validity of the faith by the gift of their blood. Martyrs to the faith were the product of the proclamation of the gospel from the very beginning. It could be we don't pay enough attention to what's going on in the life of faith, especially our own lives of faith and what it costs to believe, because we simply expect, down deep, for our faith to be something of great price. Martyrdom is simply part of the territory. It doesn't go unnoticed, however. Reading through the book of Acts, we're presented with the scenario of the martyrdom of St. Stephen, the first of the martyrs. His arrest and the accusations against him parallel almost exactly the trial and condemnation of Jesus. That's no accident. Martyrs are those who share in the experience of and the dynamics of Jesus' own death. In fact, they revive the gospel by their witness. At least this is what we see as Stephen dies. He duplicates the example of Christ almost exactly as he surrenders his life into the hands of those who wanted to crush the gospel. He dies with the hope of imitating Christ on his lips. This is the power of martyrdom. The one who offers his life reignites the dynamic power of the example of Jesus. St. Paul said it well when he reminds the Colossians that his sufferings added to what was lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And by this, he reminds them, and of course for us, that our participation he reminds us of our participation in the redeeming power of Christ. When our lives are lived as gifts and are offered to the Lord as a gift to others, then we participate in the redemption of the world. Our sufferings do not simply evaporate into the meaninglessness of the world. They contribute to its salvation. And martyrs who offer their whole lives are redeeming the world by what they give. St. Paul himself adds to the gift of redemption when he offers his whole life to the gospel by his preaching, by his witness to Christ, and finally, by his blood. Pope Benedict made this plain also in his comment that the dynamic of the cross was inexhaustible. The gospel of Jesus would never cease, he said, because to stamp it out by causing others to suffer reignites the dynamic that began it. The more persecution there is against those who believe, the more the power of the cross becomes evident. It was the teacher Tertullian in the early church who wrote that the blood of martyrs was the seedbed of the faith. And so it is. When people are killed for their belief in Christ, they imitate what Christ has done. And by imitating him, they make his example more potent and more powerful. Again, this happens because we're able to see in their sufferings the example of Christ himself. It's always seemed to me that the crucifix is the most potent symbol of the Christian life. After all, we don't carry images of the empty tomb. We haven't made a big deal of the images of the risen Jesus. Instead, we have images of the cross. Our potent symbol is of the suffering Jesus endured. This is because we all know what suffering is. It's our participation in the life of Christ, one that we will inevitably become a part of, and we know it. Resurrection, that lies in anticipation. Our empty tombs, those are in the future. Our immortality is only in potential. But our crosses, they are ours to carry and to die on every day. But what we experience in the power of our own suffering takes place while the rest of the world goes by. We can't expect the world to stop and to notice the witness of martyrdom. Most of the time, the testimony of suffering goes unremarked and uncommented on. Suffering and death is often dismissed as random or confusing, and therefore as without meaning, and therefore purposeless. Martyrs are not usually recognized or appreciated when they're martyrs. It's only later on. The second thing to notice about the fact of martyrs in the world is that they define the rips in the fabric of the world. These witnesses witness to the world as it truly is, not as we would like it to be or as we would have it to be. In Nigeria, for example, the flashpoint of our Christian civilization is highlighted by the sufferings there. In that place where Christians live in peril, it's a parable of what faces us everywhere in the world. If we pay attention to what their sacrifices indicate, we'll come to know our world in a way we won't know it otherwise. We might talk of economics and pollution and climate change as the issues most pressing on us in our world. And in each of these, our anxieties mount as our imaginations are prompted to imagined concerns. If you tune into our media, it's easy to imagine that there are no more pressing realities than to reduce carbon emissions or to slow down the growth of the deficit. And in our suburban minds, perhaps, we can't speak of any other thing than these abstractions. However, the world in which we play out our anxieties and live our concerns day to day, that world is awash in blood spilled because of belief as witnesses to the truth every day. That's what martyrdom points out to us, where the concerns of the real world really are. In the Roman world of the first century, the beliefs of the Christians began to upset the fabric of society. There, in that world, the defined places and set relationships that made society function were understood. And two of those relationships were the relationship between slaves and their owners, and then the relationship between fathers and their families. And when Christians began to practice their belief that they were all one in Christ, they began to alter the stable understandings of those relationships, and that resulted in the alteration of society lashing out at the Christians in their beliefs. It wasn't as we imagine. Slaves did not suddenly become uppity and rebellious because they gave their lives to Jesus. No, the relationship between slaves and owners began to become undone when owners began to treat slaves as human beings rather than solely as property or beasts. When free men began to make way in their society for slaves who had immortal souls and were brothers in belief, Then the world of slavery became something else. The powers of society began to lash out at them, and martyrdom followed. It was often directed at slaves and not at their owners, but this rip in the fabric of practice and belief first led to the undermining of slavery, and then eventually led to the disappearance of it in the empire. And fathers of families, they found out that their daughters placed their relationship with Jesus over their commitment to the family, and then the fathers became distraught. These daughters were not only the vehicles for carrying the family name forward, they were also integral to guarding and protecting the familial gods of the family. Interrupting this kind of piety meant that the father couldn't serve the gods that were his focus, and the father was always fearful that that would incur the wrath of the gods. It was the women, especially, who upset the train, especially young women. Without the prospect of the next generation provided for, the family and the protection of the divinity, the gods in the family, would wither and then die. There were innumerable women martyrs in the early church who were put to death because they refused the arrangements of their families and would not marry. These mostly young women weren't squeamish about family life or ignorant of how babies were made, and therefore having known these things, they didn't want to stay away from the ickiness of those things. What they stayed away from was that they wanted to witness to what they knew, which was that being committed to Christ was more important than commitment to these other gods. St. Agnes, St. Cecilia, Saints Perpetua and Felicity, and the entire list of women whose names fill the Roman martyrology, they were examples of those who were willing to witness to the power of Christ and the importance of serving Him and Him alone. Society began to change because of the power of their belief. Its change was marked by the blood of the martyrs. Anybody interested in where the breakover points of societal change in the ancient world were would have to begin with the story of these martyrs. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for us, most of us aren't martyrs. Martyrdom isn't the norm. Those who give their blood and witness by who give their lives and witness by their blood, they are extraordinary. Most of the time, we simply stand by and watch. We don't have to feel guilty about this. It's simply a matter of the reality of the situation. Martyrs are the exception, and we thank God for that. For example, in the village of Santiago Atitlan, a place of 30,000 people when Father Rother was there, about 150 or so people were killed. Some of these were caught up as promoters and then recipients of the violence of the time. Some were scooped up by the cruelty of the moment and paid for their mistakes and their allegiances by their blood. But most of the 150 were those who were captured and murdered just because they were believers, because they witnessed to the truth of the faith. When Father Rother was murdered and his body was autopsied so that it could be sent back to the U.S. for burial, his heart was left behind and eventually interred as a monument to his witness there in Santiago. It was placed in the floor of the church behind the high altar, and a granite stone was placed over it as a testimony to his sacrifice for the people and as an example of the violence of the time. So, however, at the 15th anniversary of his death, his successor in the parish, Father McSherry, had this heart and the monument moved to near the front door of the church. The previous monument had been hard to find. The area behind the altar was dark and isolated, and even those of us who knew it was there sometimes had a hard time locating it. By putting it near the door, everyone who came into the church could note it and honor it, which was Father McSherry's intent. But he also wanted to have the chance to honor the other 100-plus people whose lives had been ground up in the violence of the time. The bloody witness demanded of them was important too. He wanted them and their lives to be remembered. But even with this, most of the people in the village at the time simply watched. They were affected by the violence and the horror, but their lives were not demanded, as was Father Rother's and all these others. Martyrdom is, to some extent, on the fringes or on the sidelines. Each martyr acts as a kind of example, representative of the place and the time of their death. It's been this way from the beginning. Each martyr represents the sufferings and persecution and challenge taking place in each community, rather than simply embodying it. Besides, no one at the time knew who would be the ones to die, and no one knew or could tell who would bear the challenge of remaining faithful even in the face of torture and death. The challenges of this time were everywhere and were faced by everyone. Those who were martyred witnessed to the reality that hung over everyone. Their witness made real what was invisible to everyone until it became visible in the blood and death of the martyrs. And finally, as John Paul wrote so eloquently, and as Pope Francis has duplicated, this is the age of martyrs. We are living right now in our time in the age when the extraordinary witness of Christian faith is happening right before our eyes. We may be ignorant of it. It might not have much of an impact in our day-to-day living of the faith, and our lives may not be changed much because of it. But the truth of the matter is that there are more of these witnesses to the life of Christ in our midst now, at our time, than ever before at one place in time in the history of the church. This means, on the one hand, the faith is alive and is powerfully present in our world. While we might think of it as something that has run out of energy in our society, the witness of the rest of the world betrays this. The blood of martyrs and the seedbed they prepare will raise up a powerful witness all over the world. Who knows, it may even prompt a greater belief among us. On the other hand, it costs something to believe. In Nigeria, it's cost 52,000 lives in the last decade or so. In other parts of the world, the sum of the price of belief has been even more extreme. We know from the Gospels and Jesus' own words that the price of belief isn't cheap. The history of the church demonstrates this truth in extreme ways. And so we have to wonder, in our time and among us, are we up to it? Are we prepared to pay the price for what believing will entail? This isn't just idle speculation or an empty question. Over and over in our society right now, and all among us, we see those who threaten death and destruction to the church and to its teaching and to all those who live in it. This isn't Sudan or Nigeria or the Congo. Today, in our polity and in our streets, there exists an energy of opposition to the church, and that opposition talks about bullets and bombs and murder. We have to be reminded they're talking about us. What will be the price of our belief? We're Christians. We Catholics, we celebrate martyrs. We know these men and women who have poured out their blood as the wages of truth are our future as well as our past. And we know they are our hope. If they can live in the truth, so can we. The age of martyrs is the age that defines us. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment. We have a poem today called The Statue in the Back of the Chapel. The statue stands along the wall and back, solemn in its plaster gaze. He was such that he amazed all who knew him, had praised his fulsome life with no known dint or lack. And the visitors flocked there to touch and look, his figure not to be ignored, and his face the open door to his exampled life outpoured. So he was less statue than open book. But I tend to think its likeness to him pales when we consider the sum of he who in time succumbed to the challenges dunned as he risked his life to serve, witness, and fail. We ourselves use this image to make numb and conclude he was thus a man weathering the gusts, worries, and fears, but husks as he, secure, walked into the maelstrom. Of all, this statue's best feature must be, it's a reminder of his life, the subtle blade and knife, reminding us of the price he paid to live his gift of sanctity. That's the statue in the back of the chapel. The challenge of living Catholic is the challenge always of facing what is ours, that our life of faith, our circumstances, and our day. That's what we want all of us, want to invite everyone to be a part of as we continue to explore what would be living Catholic. Hope you can join us in the future.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.